Welcome, and thank you for being here. This talk focuses on how cyber conflict reshapes traditional ideas about deterrence, escalation, and strategic stability. Cyber operations are often discussed in technical terms, but their implications extend far beyond networks and code. They intersect with physical infrastructure, economic systems, military readiness, and international security in ways that challenge long-standing assumptions about how conflict is managed. Rather than treating cyber activity as a separate or exceptional domain, this discussion approaches it as part of the broader strategic landscape. The aim is to understand why traditional deterrence struggles in cyberspace, how states have adapted through persistent engagement, and why escalation management has become central to cyber strategy. By examining theory alongside real-world consequences, including cyber operations that produce physical effects, this talk explores how cyber conflict operates below the threshold of war while still carrying significant strategic risk. With that framing in place, we can begin by grounding cyber conflict in theory and examining why it matters for understanding everything that follows. Cyber conflict is often discussed as a technical problem, malware, exploits, networks, but that framing obscures what is actually at stake. Cyber operations are strategic actions embedded in political competition, military planning, and international security. To understand their consequences, we have to start with theory. The discussion begins by grounding cyber conflict in deterrence theory, not because deterrence no longer matters, but because its assumptions, clear attribution, clear thresholds, and predictable retaliation begin to break down in cyberspace. That breakdown helps explain why cyber competition looks persistent rather than episodic, and why states continue operating below traditional thresholds of war. From that tension emerges persistent engagement. Rather than relying on delayed retaliation, persistent engagement accepts continuous competition as a condition of the domain and focuses on shaping behavior, reducing surprise, and managing escalation risk in real time. That shift matters because cyber operations do not remain confined to the digital domain. They intersect with physical infrastructure, economic stability, and military readiness. Once cyber actions are capable of producing real-world effects, escalation becomes a strategic concern rather than a hypothetical one. All of this unfolds in a legal environment that remains fragmented and underdeveloped. The absence of unified global cyber law normalizes gray zone behavior and reinforces the need for operational strategies rather than purely legal solutions. Taken together, these dynamics explain why persistent engagement functions as escalation management in cyberspace, and why understanding that logic is essential for making sense of modern cyber conflict. Cyber conflict is often treated as a technical problem. Tools, vulnerabilities, exploits, but that framing misses the larger issue. Cyber operations are not just technical acts. They are strategic actions embedded in political competition, military planning, and international security dynamics. Theory matters because it provides the conceptual structure needed to understand patterns of behavior, escalation risk, and strategic intent. Without theory, cyber activity looks like noise, isolated incidents, hacks, or breaches. With theory, those same actions become legible as signaling, coercion, shaping behavior, or preparing the environment. Cyber theory allows us to distinguish between activity that is merely disruptive and activity that is strategically meaningful. This is why cyber cannot be separated from broader security studies. It must be analyzed using the same intellectual rigor applied to deterrence, escalation, and conflict management. That need for rigor becomes especially clear when cyber conflict is examined through the lens of classical deterrence theory. Because deterrence assumptions break down in cyberspace, states shift from punishment-based deterrence to persistent engagement focused on escalation management rather than conflict prevention. This is not a claim about preference, it's a claim about structural constraints. Traditional deterrence theory was developed in a world of kinetic weapons and clearly identifiable actors. At its core, deterrence relies on the ability to influence an adversary's decision-making by shaping their expectations about cost and consequences. If the cost of an action outweighs the perceived benefits, rational actors are expected to refrain from that action. This framework assumes relatively clear signaling, stable attribution, and a shared understanding of thresholds. Deterrence works best when actors know what behaviors are unacceptable and what responses those behaviors will trigger. During the Cold War, nuclear deterrence operated under these assumptions, with relatively clear red lines and catastrophic consequences anchoring strategic stability. The challenge is not that deterrence theory is wrong, but that it rests on conditions that are difficult to reproduce in cyberspace. For deterrence to function, several conditions must be met simultaneously. The deterring actor must be able to attribute hostile behavior with confidence, communicate credible threats, and demonstrate the ability and willingness to impose cost. The adversary, in turn, must recognize those signals and believe that retaliation will follow. These requirements depend heavily on clarity, clarity of actor, clarity of action, clarity of consequence. Deterrence begins to erode when attribution is uncertain, signaling is ambiguous, or responses are delayed or contested. When these requirements are applied to cyber operations, cracks begin to appear. The assumptions that underpin deterrence theory do not translate cleanly into a domain characterized by anonymity, speed, and ambiguity. This all unfolds in a domain where legal thresholds remain unsettled. Cyber operations undermine deterrence by destabilizing nearly every requirement it depends on. Attribution is rarely immediate or uncontested. Intent is difficult to infer. Actions can be covert, incremental, and plausibly deniable. Even when an attack is detected, determining whether it constitutes espionage, coercion, or preparation for conflict is often unclear. Cyber activity also tends to operate below traditional thresholds of armed conflict. This allows states to pursue strategic objectives without triggering formal responses, weakening the credibility of deterrent threats. Instead of deterring action, ambiguity incentivizes experimentation and probing. These dynamics shift cyber conflict away from episodic confrontation and towards continuous competition, where traditional deterrence struggles to impose restraint. Attribution sits at the center of cyber instability. Technical attribution may be strong, but political and legal attribution are far more complex. States may know who is responsible for an operation while being unable or unwilling to prove it publicly. This gap weakens deterrence by delaying or diluting responses. Delayed attribution creates decision-making dilemmas. Retaliating too quickly risks escalation based on incomplete information. Waiting too long undermines credibility. In some cases, states may choose not to respond at all, reinforcing perception of permissiveness. This persistent uncertainty reshapes strategic behavior. Rather than preventing cyber operations, attribution challenges normalize them, reinforcing the sense that cyberspace is a domain of constant, low-level contestation. Persistent engagement emerges as a strategic response to this environment. Instead of relying on episodic punishment after an attack occurs, persistent engagement assumes that cyber competition is continuous and unavoidable. The goal is not to eliminate adversary behavior, but to shape it through constant interaction. This approach reframes deterrence. Rather than focusing solely on retaliation, it emphasizes presence, disruption, and influence within adversary networks. Persistent engagement accepts ambiguity as a condition of the domain and seeks to manage risk through sustained contact rather than delayed response. Once cyber competition is continuous rather than episodic, escalation risk doesn't disappear. It becomes something that must be managed in real time. Understanding persistent engagement requires moving beyond deterrence as a static concept and towards escalation management as a dynamic process. Cyber conflict exists largely below the threshold of armed conflict, yet escalation risks remain real. Actions taken in cyberspace can have strategic consequences even when they do not meet legal definitions of attack or war. Escalation control below war focuses on managing these risks in an environment where conflict is ongoing but rarely declared. The emphasis shifts from preventing all hostile activity to preventing miscalculation, surprise, and uncontrolled escalation. This framing becomes especially important once the physical consequences of cyber operations are considered. When deterrence operates under ambiguity rather than clear thresholds, the consequences of cyber actions matter more than their intent, because effects, not labels, drive escalation. Cyber conflict cannot be understood solely as a digital phenomenon. It intersects with physical infrastructure, economic systems, and military readiness. Persistent engagement operates within this broader strategic landscape where cyber actions can generate effects far beyond the digital domain. Escalation in cyberspace is not hypothetical. It is embedded in the same strategic logic that governs other forms of conflict, even if the mechanisms differ. Understanding this requires examining how cyber operations translate into real-world consequences. The Stuxnet operation illustrates how cyber capabilities can produce physical destruction. By manipulating industrial control systems, the attack caused centrifuges to fail while masking the disruption from operators. No kinetic weapons were used, yet physical damage occurred. This case challenges the notion that cyber conflict is inherently nonviolent. Cyber operations can achieve effects traditionally associated with kinetic force, often with greater deniability and less immediate escalation. Once cyber operations are recognized as capable of producing kinetic effects, escalation risk must be reassessed. A critical insight in cyber escalation is that attacker intent does not determine escalation risk. Perception does. Once a cyber operation is perceived as threatening core national interests, responses may escalate rapidly, regardless of the attacker's original goals. Because cyber operations can affect financial systems, critical infrastructure, or military readiness, responses often jump domains. A cyber incident may lead to economic sanctions, diplomatic retaliation, or kinetic military action, even if no physical damage has yet occurred. This creates a dangerous dynamic where escalation pathways are nonlinear and difficult to predict. Cyber conflict does not follow a clear escalation ladder. Instead, it unfolds through cascading reactions across domains. Persistent engagement seeks to mitigate this risk by maintaining visibility and interaction, reducing surprise, and shaping adversary behavior before crises emerge. In cyber conflict, perception matters more than intention. An operation perceived as preparation for attack may trigger responses regardless of the attacker's goals. This shifts escalation dynamics away from rational signaling and towards defensive overreaction. Because cyber actions can affect economic stability, public trust, and military readiness, responses often extend beyond cyberspace. These cross-domain reactions introduce new escalation pathways that are difficult to predict or control. Cyber escalation rarely remains confined to a single domain. Economic sanctions, diplomatic crisis, and military posturing frequently follow significant cyber incidents. These cascading effects blur the boundaries between cyber conflict and traditional security competition. This interconnectedness makes escalation management far more complex. Actions intended to remain limited can trigger broader strategic consequences due to how they are perceived and interpreted. In practice, persistent engagement is operationalized through a set of actions that look very different from traditional deterrence or retaliation. Rather than waiting for a major attack and responding with punishment after the fact, persistent engagement emphasizes defending forward, disrupting early, and increasing friction across adversary operations. Defending forward means operating as close to the source of adversary activity as possible. Instead of relying solely on perimeter defense or domestic response, states seek visibility into adversary networks, infrastructure, and operational patterns. This allows defenders to observe emerging threats, understand tactics, and reduce the likelihood of strategic surprise. The objective is not dominance or destruction, but awareness and positioning. Disrupting early refers to intervening before adversary cyber operations mature into more damaging or escalatory actions. These disruptions are often subtle, degrading infrastructure, slowing command and control, or forcing adversaries to expend resources adapting their tools. Importantly, these actions are designed to remain below thresholds that would trigger major retaliation, while still imposing real operational cost. Increasing friction means making it harder, slower, and more expensive for adversaries to operate effectively. Rather than delivering a single decisive blow, persistent engagement introduces continuous obstacles that disrupt planning, execution, and coordination. Over time, this friction shapes adversary behavior by limiting freedom of maneuver and reducing confidence in operational success. What distinguishes persistent engagement from traditional deterrence is the scale and tempo of these actions. They are small, frequent, and ongoing rather than episodic or retaliatory. There is no expectation that a single action will change behavior. Instead, stability is pursued through cumulative effects, constant pressure, continuous interaction, and managed competition. This approach reflects an acceptance that cyber conflict is not an exception, but a persistent condition. Persistent engagement does not seek to end competition in cyberspace. It seeks to manage escalation, reduce surprise, and prevent isolated cyber actions from cascading into broader economic or kinetic conflict. A common misconception is that cyber operations are inherently non-physical. In reality, many cyber operations target cyber-physical systems, digital systems that directly control physical processes. The canonical example is Stuxnet. Rather than stealing information or causing a temporary disruption, Stuxnet targeted industrial control systems at Iran's Natanz nuclear enrichment facility. The malware manipulated the rotational speed of centrifuges while simultaneously feeding false telemetry to operators. Engineers believed systems were operating normally while physical degradation and destruction occurred. No bombs were dropped, no missiles were launched, yet real kinetic damage resulted. This case fundamentally changed how cyber operations are understood. Cyber capabilities can be used to achieve physical effects traditionally associated with kinetic force, but in ways that are covert, deniable, and difficult to attribute. This collapses the conceptual distinction between cyber conflict and physical warfare. Legal frameworks have not kept pace with cyber capabilities. There is no unified global agreement on what constitutes a cyber attack, when self-defense is justified, or how proportionality should be assessed. This legal ambiguity reinforces gray zone behavior. States exploit uncertainty to advance strategic objectives while avoiding accountability. Norms emerge through practice rather than formal agreement, further entrenching competition. Persistent engagement reflects this reality. It functions in a domain where law provides limited guidance and behavior sets expectations. Cyberspace lacks a universally accepted, binding legal framework governing state behavior. While states broadly agree that existing international laws applies to cyberspace, there is no consensus on how key concepts such as sovereignty, use of force, or armed attack translate into cyber operations. There are no agreed-upon thresholds defining when a cyber operation constitutes an act of war or justifies self-defense. Attribution further complicates matters as technical confidence does not equal legal proof. This legal ambiguity incentivizes gray zone conflict. States deliberately operate below thresholds to avoid retaliation while still achieving strategic objectives. Over time, persistence, cyber competition, becomes normalized. In this environment, state behavior, not treaties, sets norms. Persistent engagement reflects this reality. It is not lawless behavior, but an adaptive strategy in a domain where law has not kept pace with technological capability. As we wrap up, let's go over some key takeaways. First, cyber operations are not abstract or consequence-free. As demonstrated by cases like Stuxnet, cyber capabilities can produce real, physical, kinetic effects. This means cyber conflict must be understood as part of the broader spectrum of warfare rather than as a separate or purely technical domain. Digital actions can directly affect physical infrastructure, human safety, and national security. Second, escalation in cyberspace is driven less by attacker intent and more by ambiguity and perception. Because cyber operations obscure intent, defenders are often forced to assume worst-case scenarios. The same intrusion may be interpreted as espionage, coercion, or preparation for kinetic attack. This uncertainty increases the likelihood of miscalculation, particularly during periods of political or military tension. Third, cyber conflict typically occurs below traditional war thresholds. States deliberately operate in this space to achieve strategic objectives while avoiding clear triggers for armed conflict. However, operating below thresholds does not eliminate escalation risk. It shifts escalation into a domain where signaling is weak, attribution is contested, and response options are unclear. Fourth, the absence of a unified global cyber legal framework reinforces this dynamic. There are no universally accepted thresholds for what constitutes a use of force in cyberspace, no binding enforcement mechanisms, and no shared escalation ladder. As a result, gray zone cyber activity becomes normalized. Over time, state behavior itself sets the rules of the road rather than formal international law. And finally, persistent engagement should be understood as a strategy of escalation management, not as an admission that deterrence has failed. Persistent engagement accepts that cyber competition is ongoing and seeks to reduce surprise, shape adversary behavior, and limit the risk that cyber activity spills over into economic or kinetic conflict. It is an adaptive response to a domain defined by ambiguity, constant contact, and legal uncertainty. Taken together, these points underscore why cyber strategy cannot rely solely on traditional deterrence models. Cyber conflict requires continuous engagement, careful escalation management, and an understanding that stability in cyberspace is maintained not by clear red lines, but by persistent interaction. Thank you for your time and attention. The central point of this talk is that cyber conflict reshapes how deterrence, escalation, and stability function. Cyber operations are not isolated technical events. They are strategic actions that operate under conditions of ambiguity, persistence, and legal uncertainty. As a result, traditional deterrence assumptions, clear thresholds, clear attribution, and predictable retaliation are increasingly strained. Persistent engagement reflects an adaptation to this environment. Rather than attempting to eliminate cyber competition, it focuses on managing escalation, reducing surprise, and shaping adversary behavior in a domain where conflict is continuous rather than episodic. I'm happy to take questions, particularly on how these dynamics affect deterrence theory, escalation management, or the strategic implications of persistent engagement. Thank you. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out. My email address is on the slide. Once again, thank you for your time and attention.